Now, they say it's a record. 20 defeats in just over a week for the government's illegal migration bill. Now, the bill was introduced by the Home Secretary in March to reduce the number of small boats that are crossing the English Channel. But it's faced very strong opposition, not least from the Archbishop of Canterbury, who previously called it morally unacceptable. Now, among the amendments that have been handed down from the Lords to the bill that was passed, they've obliged the government to create even more safe and legal routes into the UK for asylum seekers. And indeed, the bill will be back in the Lords again tomorrow with no doubt more amendments. And I'm sure that two of my guests today will be there debating it, because I'm joined on the line by Baroness Fox, who is an independent member of the House of Lords. Here in the studio with me is Lord Daniel Moylan, who is a Conservative peer. And I've also got the writer and broadcaster Matthew Stadlen. Now, I'd like to begin, if I may, Baroness Fox, with you, as you don't have the privilege of being in the studio. It's, I think, fairly clear that the Lords want to destroy this bill. Indeed, I think you are on record as saying that it's a load of old rubbish. So why are you all wasting time playing a kind of political ping-pong with this bill by sending amendments backwards and forwards between the Lords and the Commons? Why don't you just get rid of it and come up with an alternative which will work?
Well, to clarify my position, I have made the point that I think there are serious problems with the bill. I actually voted for one of the amendments that you referred to, only one, which was on the safe routes, to expand those, because indeed that was put forward by a backbench Conservative and was backed across the House. And I have some sympathy with that there are criticisms to be made of the bill. However, I've also made it very clear that the atmosphere in the Lords at the moment is not a serious one of scrutinising and in good faith putting forward amendments. It is to destroy the bill, which I completely disagree with. I think it's incredibly anti-democratic. And in fact, I've spoken a couple of times on the way that the movers of these amendments have basically said, you can't do this, even if the British people want to, because it goes against all of these international conventions that we've signed up to and so on and so forth. They're effectively saying it doesn't matter that the public wants to control borders. It doesn't matter whether the government has come up with this scheme. We're not going to let it pass. And I disagree with that approach. I think you can criticise the bill, which I sometimes will be prepared to do, without being so determined in bad faith to halt it in an unelected chamber like the House of Lords.
But there is so much criticism about it and so much opposition to it. I'd like to ask you, and indeed Lord Moylan, who's with me in the studio, if it is thought to be such a bad piece of legislation, why isn't anybody coming up with an alternative to stop these boats?
Well, I don't know. You have to ask the people who are opposing it what their alternative is. And it would be nice if there was an alternative. It'd be wonderful if there was a magic way of stopping this from happening. But the people of this country are obviously feeling cheesed off that you have all these people coming across who are in some ways cheating the system. They're coming across in boats and they shouldn't be. And the idea that they could be taken somewhere that is safe out of this country might be a way of resolving that. That's what the bill allows. And there are an awful lot of people who are really trying to wreck it. It's hard to see in some ways why they're trying to wreck it if they haven't got an alternative for dealing with it. Some of them actually believe, and I won't say who, but some of them actually, I think, believe that we should just welcome all these people in. We have an obligation that anyone who lands here, we should welcome them in, and that's the end of the story. I don't agree with that. Most people, I think, in this country don't agree with that. Others, again, are very hung up on this idea about international conventions that we've signed up to. Now, the government argues that this bill doesn't actually breach those international conventions, that we're not breaching them. Well, we are perhaps slightly reinterpreting them in some ways, but we're still sort of on the right side of the letter of those conventions. And that's an argument I can't really get involved in because I'm not an international lawyer. But there has to be some solution to this problem, and nobody is coming up with one.
That's the problem, isn't it? No one's coming up with them. Matthew, I'm sure that you will disagree with a lot of what we've just heard. But let me ask you this. We've already spent 140 million. We've given it to Rwanda, and we've actually got nothing back for it at the moment. Would that money be better spent by actually trying to have more people, perhaps in France, the other side of the channel, vetting many of the people that want to come across? And we've got, I think it's, what, 160 60,000 people in this country already who are waiting for some kind of decision. And there is, I think, the possibility that within those people, many of them have got skills that we could use. Nurses, doctors, lawyers, engineers, people prepared to work for a living in this country. Is that where you think the money should be spent?
Well, we've got people rotting away, haven't we, on the sort of waiting list, waiting for their cases to be processed by, in my view, an incompetent government. These people could be contributing really valuably to our society. Do I want people to come here illegally to cheat the system? No. Do I want there to be safe routes where they can be properly and efficiently processed? Yes. I mean, what Daniel says, what Lord Moylan said just then, implies, I think, that the Rwanda bill, even if it gets through in the end, will work. We've got no evidence whatsoever that it will work. Let's step back just for a moment and look at the big picture. This is Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman's flagship policy. This has to work for them. Otherwise, they are completely doomed at the next general election. And it is failing at every obstacle. It is being knocked about, bashed about in the House of Lords, whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of having an unelected second chamber. That's what's happening. It has been found to be unlawful by a majority verdict, not unanimously, in the Court of Appeal by 2-1. The Lord Chief Justice actually, his decision was in favour of the government, but he had to read out the others, because that was his role, and it was turned down in the Court of Appeal. It may win in the Supreme Court, we don't know. What I'm trying to get across here is that this is grotesque incompetence. Rwanda was never a serious solution to this problem, and it is a problem.
And it's an international problem. Isn't that the problem, Baroness Fox? It is an international problem, isn't it? And nobody seems to be coming up with anything. The Labour Party, I think, have come up with 5 points, a 5-point plan, which basically boils down to just having greater planning and cooperation with the French. Well, Sunak has already tried that, and that hasn't really worked. So, you know, where are we going to go with this? Because there are so many people who still like the Archbishop of Canterbury, feel that this is an immoral way to deal with people who might have a very genuine reason for wanting to escape their countries and come to here for a new life.
But I think that's the problem, that we're not having this conversation in good faith. When the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord spoke, and I was there when he made his point, you always get the impression that the moral people are the ones who are opposed to this bill. The immoral people are anyone who tries to have a practical solution. And I think that that has coloured the discussion, because instead of being able to really address the problem, you almost feel as though you're being gaslit. You know, when I've raised in the past in problems about the way refugee status is almost assumed as the default position for people, when in fact many of them, even if you can understand why they do it, just want a better life, and that's why they come here. The assumption is that everyone who applies is coming in good faith, that they're obviously fleeing war and terror, and we know that that is not true. So the public feels so frustrated that they're being told by parliamentarians you can't do anything. And one thing I'd like to query that Lord Moylan said is that the government try and say this fits in with international conventions. I would suggest that a lot of those international conventions are not fit for purpose. Everybody cites the 1951 Refugee Convention, but that was in very different circumstances drawn up today. So one of the reasons, and you know, where we know people were fleeing Nazism, where people were fleeing, you know, the horrors of Stalinism or what have you. Now we're in a situation where there's so many bases on which you can say, I am a refugee. The amendments in the Lords have made it even wider. You know, it's escaping LGBTQ plus persecution. That is one of the amendments that got passed. That means half the world is going to arrive.
Daniel.
We've got to recognise that what's going on here is that there is a huge international business involved, a huge criminal travel agents.
And isn't the question then how you stop that?
That people pay money or sell themselves into bondage in order to get to travel from one side of the world to the other, one side of Europe to the other, in order to come to England. And we have to find a way of disrupting their business model to stop them from making money. So if you know that paying your £3,000 or £4,000 or whatever it is to get on one of those boats is going to result in you being taken off the beach and rapidly placed taken somewhere else, and the bill doesn't actually mention Rwanda, it's two separate issues, in fact, to some other safe place, then you'll think twice about paying that money to them.
But it's not
that's
working.
The idea.
It isn't
hasn't
working.
happened yet.
To my mind, the key thing for the government, whether it's the Tory government now or a Labour government in the future, is to develop the best possible relations with our European neighbours post-Brexit. We have to be working at a micro and a macro level with Macron, with the French government, and saying, you guys have to do better. You have to police your shores better than you're doing at the moment. Let me just quickly say, because I think it's really important, some of the amendments in the Lords, what are they voting about? They are voting to ensure that the limit on unaccompanied children remains at 24 hours of detention. Can you imagine an unaccompanied child getting to this country through no fault of their own? Whatever you think of people coming here more generally, they can't be detained for longer than 24 hours. Pregnant women. The Lords have voted to make sure, in this amendment, that pregnant women are not detained for longer than 72 hours. This is basic humanity. And whether or not, as I say, you agree with an unelected second chamber, surely they've got this right.
Why are unaccompanied children, genuine unaccompanied children, on these boats in the first place? That's the first question. And the second point is, as you know, there are people, I don't know how many, it might be few, who turn up claiming to be children. It's very hard to prove. And, of course, they're in fact adults. Yeah. So this whole system is full of abuse and trickery, and you have to box people.
I'm going to stop you both, unfortunately, because we are running out of time. You'll have much more time to discuss this in the Lords as from tomorrow. Matthew, thank you very much indeed. And Baroness Fox, also thank you all for joining us.